109 times. Between the year 250 and the late 20th century, over 100 different jurisdictions across the globe issued formal decrees to physically remove every Jewish person from within their borders. These were not mere suggestions or localized riots. These were state-level mandates, edicts signed by kings, emperors, and parliaments. In the year 1290, King Edward I expelled them from England. In 1394, Charles VI threw them out of France. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella purged them from Spain. The list includes Hungary, Austria, Germany, Italy, Lithuania, Portugal, and even the Papal States. Most history books treat these events as isolated bursts of religious hatred or inexplicable madness. They frame them as a series of disconnected tragedies fueled by superstition. But the cold data of the state archives tells a different story. When you map these events alongside the debt cycles of the ruling elite, a terrifying mechanical pattern emerges. It is a pattern that explains why the most powerful empires on Earth repeatedly turned on a specific minority that was often the backbone of their own administrative systems. One specific document sitting in the National Archives in London contains a single number that explains the fall of the English Jewish community better than any religious text ever could. We will get to that number. There was also a man in Spain whose name most have forgotten, who used the expulsion to fund the most famous voyage in human history. And most importantly, there is a recurring economic trigger that has appeared in every major expulsion for 2,000 years, and it is beginning to show up in the modern financial system today. By the end of this investigation, you will see the map of world history through a lens that has been scrubbed from the textbooks. You will understand the dark symbiosis between the crown and the counting house. You will know exactly why these decrees were signed, who profited from the abandoned homes and the canceled debts, and why the cycle repeated with such mathematical precision. The story begins not with a prayer, but with a ledger. In the autumn of 1290, the roads of England were choked with people moving toward the coast. Over 15,000 souls were forced toward the ports of London, Colchester, and Sandwich. King Edward I had issued the Edict of Expulsion, making England the first major European power to legally mandate a total clearing of its Jewish population. To the common observer at the time, it looked like a crusade for religious purity. But the king was not thinking about the soul. He was thinking about his empty treasury. Edward was a man of war. He had spent his reign battering the Welsh and the Scots, and his military campaigns had left the English crown in a state of functional bankruptcy. He owed staggering sums to Italian bankers, specifically the Riccardi of Lucca. But more importantly, he owed his own barons and knights. The feudal system was grinding to a halt because the king could no longer pay for the loyalty he required. This was the era of the usury laws. The Christian church strictly forbade the lending of money at interest between Christians. In an economy that required credit to function, this created a structural vacuum. The Jewish population, excluded from land ownership and most trade guilds, was forced by the state into the one profession the church prohibited: money lending. This was not a choice made by the community. It was a cage built by the law. The Jewish moneylenders became the unofficial tax collectors of the realm. They would lend to the nobility and the peasantry, and the king would then tallage or tax the Jewish community to reclaim those profits. It was a closed-circuit system that allowed the king to bypass the church's ban on interest while keeping his hands clean. But by 1290, the system had broken. The Jewish community had been taxed so aggressively for so long that they were no longer a viable source of liquid cash. They were worth more to Edward dead than alive. Or, more accurately, they were worth more gone. If you have never seen this story told through the lens of sovereign debt and geopolitical survival, subscribe. We bring you deep dive investigations like this every week. When the Jewish families were forced onto those ships, they could only take what they could carry. Their land, their houses, and most importantly, their outstanding loan contracts were forfeited to the crown. In one single afternoon, Edward I liquidated the debts of his entire nobility. Every baron who owed money to a Jewish lender suddenly found their debt transferred to the king, or simply erased. It was the greatest debt jubilee in English history, and it was bought with the lives and property of a minority group. The king did not just remove a people, he reset his balance sheet. This move was so popular with the debt-burdened knights and barons that they immediately granted Edward the largest tax in the Middle Ages to show their gratitude. But Edward was just a local player. 2 centuries later, a much larger machine was spinning in the Iberian Peninsula. In 1492, the Spanish Inquisition reached its peak with the Alhambra Decree. Most people know this year for Christopher Columbus. Few realize that the ships of the expulsion and the ships of the discovery shared the same harbor and the same funding source. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just finished the Reconquista, the long war to retake Granada from the Moors. Like Edward, they were broke. The war had cost millions of maravedis. They had borrowed heavily from Jewish financiers, most notably Isaac Abravanel. According to the court records, Abravanel had personally provided the crown with massive loans to fuel the final siege of Granada. When the war was won, the crown faced a choice: pay back the massive debt with interest, or find a legal mechanism to invalidate the contract. The decree of expulsion was that mechanism. By declaring the Jewish population a threat to the spiritual health of the kingdom, Ferdinand and Isabella could seize every asset belonging to the community. They did not just take the gold. They took the buildings, the cemeteries, and the records of debt. The royal accounts show that the confiscated property was used to pay off the debts of the Spanish state and to provide the seed money for the expansion into the New World. One document in the Spanish archives reveals that the crown seized the equivalent of millions of dollars in today's currency from Jewish communal funds alone. This was state-sponsored asset stripping disguised as religious fervor. The pattern is not limited to Europe. If we look at the Byzantine Empire or the various caliphates of the Middle East, the same rhythm appears. A period of tolerance where the minority is encouraged to handle the finances and the bureaucracy. A period of high state debt caused by war or expansion. And finally, a period of demonization and expulsion where the debts are canceled and the assets are seized. It is a cycle of credit and collapse. The Jewish community was used as a human buffer between the ruling elite and the disgruntled peasantry. When the peasants grew angry about high interest rates or taxes, the king would point his finger at the Jewish lenders, despite the fact that the king was the ultimate beneficiary of every penny collected. This leads to a chilling realization. These expulsions were often timed with the exact moment a currency was being debased. In the 14th century, when Philip the Fair of France expelled the Jews, he was simultaneously devaluing the French currency by reducing its silver content. He needed a scapegoat to distract the public from the fact that their savings were being inflated away by the crown. By blaming a visible minority for the rising cost of living, he managed to stay in power while his subjects suffered from his own economic mismanagement. The French records show that Philip cleared his entire royal debt through this single act of mass removal. But why did it happen over and over? Why did the empires not learn that expelling their most productive financial class would lead to long-term economic stagnation? The answer lies in the short-term survival of the regime. A king who cannot pay his army today does not care about the GDP of his country 50 years from now. He needs liquidity. He needs a target. And he needs to reset the social contract. The Jewish community represented a mobile, liquid form of wealth that could be easily seized, unlike the land held by the powerful nobility. In the mid-20th century, the most extreme version of this pattern occurred. While the ideological horrors of the Nazi regime are well documented, the economic underpinnings are often glossed over. The Reich was functionally bankrupt by 1938. They had spent billions on rearmament and social programs. They were surviving on a complex system of internal IOUs known as MIFO bills. The seizure of Jewish property and the subsequent expulsions and mass murders were not just the result of a hateful ideology. They were also a desperate attempt to fund a war machine that had run out of legitimate credit. The declassified records from the Reich Bank show that the gold and assets stolen from the victims were integrated directly into the national budget to keep the German currency from collapsing under the weight of its own debt. Remember the number from the English National Archives? It was the value of the houses seized in 1290. It was enough to fund the entire English Navy for a year. That single realization changes how we view every decree in history. It was never just about the religion. It was about the ledger. Today, we see the same pressures building in the global economy. Massive sovereign debt, rising inflation, a public that is increasingly angry about the cost of living. History suggests that when the state can no longer pay its debts, it looks for a target. It looks for a way to reset the balance sheet without upsetting the majority. While the targets may change, the mechanics of the expulsion remain the same. The state uses a minority to manage its finances during the boom times, and then uses that same minority as a sacrifice during the bust. The records of the Spanish expulsion are still kept in the General Archive of Simancas. Among the thousands of pages, there is a letter from a royal tax official. He notes that the treasury had never been fuller, and the streets had never been quieter. He believed they had solved the problem forever. He was wrong. Within a century, the Spanish Empire was bankrupt again. They had removed the people, but they had not removed the debt-driven hunger of the state. The ghosts of the 1290 expulsion and the 1492 decrees still haunt the foundations of the modern financial world. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The final edict was signed in the same ink as the first. The ink was dry, but the cycle was not over. In a small vault in London, the original scroll of the 1290 expulsion still sits, wrapped in vellum, a silent reminder that for the state, people are often just numbers on a page waiting to be erased. The mechanism of the expulsion was never a glitch in the system. It was a feature of the state. To understand the depth of this pattern, we have to look at the 14th century, specifically the year 1306. King Philip the Fair of France was a man of cold calculation who looked at his kingdom not as a collection of souls, but as a series of assets to be harvested. He had a problem that will sound familiar to any modern student of geopolitics. He had overextended his military in Flanders, and his silver mines were running dry. He had already tried to solve his liquidity crisis by kidnapping the Pope and taxing the Church, but the returns were diminishing. On a single day in July, Philip executed a logistical operation that would make a modern intelligence agency envious. In a synchronized strike across every province of France, his officers arrested every Jewish person in the realm. There was no warning. There was no trial. The crown did not just want them gone. The crown wanted their ledgers. According to the royal accounts, the king's men spent the next several months tracking down every person who owed money to a Jewish lender. Instead of the debt being canceled, Philip declared that all debts were now owed directly to him. He became the national debt collector. He squeezed the peasantry and the merchant class for every penny of interest that had previously been negotiated, but he did it with the full power of the royal army. The archives in Paris reveal that this single maneuver generated enough capital to pay off the king's massive war debts and fund a new era of French expansion. But the pattern has a second layer that historians often ignore. This is the geopolitical layer. In the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire observed the expulsions happening in Western Europe and made a strategic decision that changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Sultan Bayezid II did not just welcome the refugees. He sent the Ottoman navy to pick them up. He famously remarked that the Catholic monarchs of Spain were foolish for impoverishing their own country while enriching his. He understood what Ferdinand did not. Wealth is not a pile of gold in a vault. Wealth is the human capital required to manage a global trade network. By taking in the expelled populations, the Ottomans gained an immediate technological and financial advantage. The refugees brought with them the secrets of advanced metalworking, the latest in European cartography, and a banking network that spanned from Antwerp to Constantinople. For a century, the Ottoman Empire surged while Spain, despite its mountains of New World gold, suffered through a series of humiliating sovereign defaults. The Spanish crown had the gold, but they had expelled the only people who knew how to turn that gold into a functioning economy. This brings us to a terrifying callback to the English situation. Remember the knights and barons who cheered when Edward I erased their debts in 1290? They thought they were free. But within 3 decades, the English economy had stalled. Without a sophisticated credit market, the kingdom could not fund its own growth. The crown was forced to turn to Italian bankers, who charged even higher rates and eventually seized English wool exports as collateral. The short-term relief of the expulsion led to a long-term loss of national sovereignty. We see this same desperation in the archives of the 1930s. While the world focused on the speeches and the rallies, the economic reality was far more cynical. The German government had created a closed economic loop through something called MIFO bills. These were essentially fake receipts used to pay defense contractors. By 1939, the bill was coming due. The state needed a massive influx of hard currency and physical property to keep the illusion alive. The Aryanization of businesses was not just a social policy. It was a massive, state-mandated asset seizure designed to plug a hole in the national budget that was billions of marks wide. The declassified ledgers of the era show that the stolen property of the victims was the only thing keeping the German mark from a total hyperinflationary collapse in the months leading up to the invasion of Poland. The common thread in every one of these 109 cases is the debt ceiling. When a civilization reaches the point where it can no longer pay the interest on its ambitions, it looks for a way to break the contract. It looks for a group that is small enough to be targeted, but visible enough to serve as a distraction. It is a cynical, repeating loop of history where the minority is invited in to build the infrastructure of credit, only to be gutted for that same infrastructure when the state goes bust. The records of the Council of Ten in Venice contain a secret report from 1600. It describes how the city-state debated whether to follow the Spanish example. One senator argued that expelling the Jews would satisfy the mob and clear the city's debts. But another senator, whose name is recorded as Paolo Sarpi, warned that a state that breaks its contracts with one group will eventually break them with everyone. He argued that the credibility of the Venetian bank was worth more than the short-term gain of a seizure. Venice chose to keep its population. Venice survived as a financial power long after the Spanish Empire had crumbled into bankruptcy. Everything you have heard today points to a single, uncomfortable truth. The expulsions were not the result of a sudden collapse in human morality. They were the result of a predictable collapse in state finance. The hatred was the tool, but the ledger was the driver. We are currently living through an era of record-breaking global debt. The numbers on the screen are larger than any king or emperor could have imagined. History tells us that the state never goes down alone. It always looks for a sacrifice. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The original decree from 1492 is still on display in the Inquisition Museum. It is a heavy piece of parchment, cold to the touch. It represents the moment a superpower chose a short-term reset over a long-term future. It is a reminder that when the math of an empire stops working, the humans are the first thing to be erased. The machinery of the state did not stop in the 17th century. As the world moved from the era of absolute monarchs to the era of mercantilism and early industrial capitalism, the pattern simply evolved. It became more sophisticated. It moved from the blunt force of the edict to the surgical precision of the tax code and the central bank. In the year 1655, a man named Manasseh ben Israel traveled from Amsterdam to London. He did not go to talk about religion. He went to talk to Oliver Cromwell about the survival of the English state. Cromwell was a pragmatic military dictator who had just overseen the execution of a king and the birth of a republic. England was surrounded by enemies and drowning in the costs of its own revolution. Cromwell realized that the expulsion of 1290 had been a tactical victory, but a strategic catastrophe. By removing the Jewish community, England had severed its connection to the emerging global trade networks of the Dutch. Cromwell did not readmit the Jews out of a sense of tolerance. He did it because he needed a merchant class that could compete with the Spanish and the Portuguese. He needed intelligence, he needed credit, and he needed people who could move capital across borders faster than a Royal Navy could sail. This reversal proves the thesis. When the state is in the early stages of expansion, it invites the minority in to build the scaffolding of the economy. When the state reaches the point of debt-saturated collapse, it tears that scaffolding down to burn it for warmth. This cycle is visible in the 19th century Russian Empire. The Pale of Settlement was a massive geographic cage designed to keep the Jewish population as a useful economic buffer on the borderlands. But whenever the Tsarist regime faced internal revolt or economic stagnation, the state-sponsored pogroms began. The Okhrana, the secret police of the Tsar, used these moments of violence to redirect the anger of the starving peasantry away from the winter palaces and toward the small shops of the shtetls. One declassified memo from a regional governor in 1881 states plainly that the riots were a useful pressure valve for the revolutionary steam building in the cities. The state was using a minority as a human lightning rod to protect the autocracy. But the most chilling expansion of this pattern happened in the world of high finance during the lead-up to the First World War. The banking houses of Europe were the ones funding the dreadnoughts and the rail lines. They were the ones who held the keys to the mobilization of millions of men. But as the war dragged on and the casualties reached into the millions, the debt reached levels that were mathematically impossible to repay. Every nation involved in the conflict was looking for a way out of the bill. In the aftermath, the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic was not an accident. It was a choice. It was a way for the German state to erase its internal debts by destroying its own currency. When the currency died, the middle class was wiped out. They looked for someone to blame for the theft of their life savings. The state did not admit it had printed the money into worthlessness. It pointed to the financiers and the outsiders. It pointed to the very people it had relied on to fund the war in the first place. This brings us to the final macro loop. We are currently watching the debt-to-gross domestic product ratios of the world's largest economies climb toward 300%. This has only happened a few times in the last 2,000 years. Each time it has happened, a major social or ethnic reset has followed. The modern state is currently addicted to a system of credit that requires constant expansion. When that expansion stops, the state has two choices. It can default on its promises to the majority, or it can seize the assets of a minority. History shows that it almost always chooses the latter, because it is the path of least resistance for those in power. The document in the British Museum that records the final departure of the Jewish community in 1290 is not just a piece of history. It is a warning. It shows that the law is whatever the king needs it to be when the treasury is empty. The pattern they do not discuss is that every empire is a predator, and its own citizens are the prey of last resort. The expulsions were the first warning signs of an imperial collapse that was already inevitable. If you have stayed this far, you now see the grid behind the map. You see that the 109 expulsions were not 109 mistakes. They were 109 attempts to fix a broken balance sheet. They were the desperate moves of a ruling class that had run out of other people's money. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The ink on the last decree is never truly dry. It is just waiting for the next debt cycle to reach its peak. In the archives of every fallen empire, the ledgers are always the last thing to be buried. They show that the cost of power is always paid by those who are least able to defend themselves, and the state never forgets where the gold is hidden. The structural integrity of this pattern depends on a concept called the sovereign trap. For 2 millennia, every empire that reached its peak followed the same fatal trajectory. They expanded until their borders were too large to defend. They spent until their taxes were too high to collect. And finally, they borrowed until their interest was too heavy to pay. This is the moment the state stops being a protector and becomes a scavenger. In the mid-17th century, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was the largest state in Europe. It was a multi-ethnic superpower that had invited the Jewish population to act as the arrendators, or the managers of the great noble estates. They were the interface between the lords and the serfs. They collected the rents, managed the mills, and kept the machinery of the feudal economy lubricated. But in 1648, the system collapsed during the Khmelnytsky uprising. The Cossacks and the peasants did not rise up against the Polish king first. They rose up against the Jewish managers who were the face of the king's taxes. The state had used this minority to shield itself from the resentment of its own people for centuries. When the violence erupted, the Polish nobility did not move to protect their managers. They stayed behind their fortress walls and watched as the buffer was shredded. The chronicles of the era describe a level of brutality that shocked even the hardened soldiers of the 30 Years' War. But the most telling detail is found in the subsequent treaties. The Polish state used the chaos to seize the remaining assets of the survivors and to default on the pensions and debts owed to the very people who had kept the Commonwealth running. The state used the tragedy to clear its books. This brings us to the economic engine of the modern era, the central bank. Most people believe the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve were created to stabilize the economy. But history reveals a darker origin. They were created to manage the permanent debt of the state. In the 19th century, as the Rothschilds and other banking families became the creditors of nations, the state found itself in a new kind of bind. It could no longer simply expel its creditors because the creditors now controlled the international flow of capital. The state had to become more clever. If you have never seen the link between central banking and the historical cycle of expulsion, subscribe. We decode the hidden mechanics of power every week. Instead of physical expulsion, the 19th and 20th centuries saw the rise of the financial expulsion. This is where the state uses inflation to devalue the wealth of the productive class. By printing money to pay for wars, the state effectively seizes a percentage of every bank account in the country without ever firing a shot or signing a decree. The victims are not moved across a border. They are moved into poverty while they stay in their own homes. The records of the 19th century Austrian Empire show that the Habsburgs used this method repeatedly to wipe out the debts they owed to Jewish and Christian financiers alike. The state simply changed the value of the paper. The callback to 1492 is essential here. Ferdinand and Isabella thought they were being pious, but they were actually being desperate. They were trying to solve a debt crisis by destroying the very mechanism that created wealth. Modern governments are doing the same thing today. They are expanding the money supply to cover the interest on their debts, which creates a social friction that always leads to the search for a scapegoat. The pattern they do not discuss is that the target is irrelevant. The target is whatever the state needs it to be to survive another 10 years. In the final months of the English Jewish community in 1290, a royal clerk wrote a summary of the properties being taken. He listed houses, shops, and even personal items like silver spoons. He noted that the total value was far beyond what the king had expected. That clerk was not a hater. He was an auditor. He was doing his job for a king who had run out of options. That is the most terrifying part of the history. It is not the work of monsters. It is the work of bureaucrats who are trying to balance an impossible ledger. The cycle of 109 expulsions is a map of sovereign insolvency. It shows that when an empire can no longer pay for its own existence, it will eat its own people. It started with the Jews because they were the ones the state had forced into the role of the financier. But the pattern does not stop there. Once a state learns it can solve its debt problems through seizure and expulsion, it eventually turns on every group that has something worth taking. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The last ship left the harbor 500 years ago, but the tide is coming back in. The debt is higher than it has ever been. The social contracts are fraying. And somewhere, in a basement of a government building, a clerk is likely looking at a list of assets and wondering how much time they can buy by hitting the reset button one more time. The history of the world is not written in blood. It is written in the red ink of a ledger that never stays balanced for long. The survival of this cycle across 20 centuries suggests that it is not a series of accidents, but a law of political physics. To understand the final phase of the pattern, we must look at the transition from the old world of kings to the new world of the globalists. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire provided the most clinical example of how a state uses a minority to manage its own decay. The czars were facing a double threat: a bankrupt agrarian economy and a rising tide of revolutionary Marxism. Their solution was the May Laws of 1882. These laws did not start with an expulsion order. They started with a restriction on where people could live and how they could trade. By stripping the Jewish population of their right to own land in rural areas, the state forced them into the cities, creating an artificial economic pressure cooker. When the inevitable social friction occurred, the state-controlled press did not blame the Tsarist failures. They blamed the people they had just displaced. The documents of the Russian secret police from this era reveal a deliberate strategy of using the Jewish community as a lightning rod. One internal memo noted that as long as the masses were focused on the shops in the Pale of Settlement, they would not be looking at the gates of the Winter Palace. It was a strategy of managed chaos that bought the Romanovs another 30 years of power. But the price of using a minority as a pressure valve is that it eventually destroys the very thing it was meant to protect. By the time the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917, it had purged or alienated the very middle class that could have provided a stable transition to a modern economy. The state had eaten its own future to survive a single decade of debt. This leads us to the most overlooked angle of the 20th century. After the fall of the traditional empires in the First World War, the world entered the era of the ethno-state. In this era, the pattern of expulsion became even more radical because the state was no longer just protecting a crown. It was protecting a myth of national purity. When the German government began its systematic seizure of assets in the 1930s, they did something the medieval kings never could. They used modern accounting. They did not just take the gold. They took the patents, the copyrights, and the insurance policies. They integrated the stolen wealth into the national healthcare and pension systems to buy the silence of the majority. The records of the Reich Finance Ministry show that by 1941, the seized assets of the Jewish community were being used to fund the basic social services of the German public. The state had turned a whole population into a literal fuel source for its own survival. Everything we have investigated leads to a single, concrete realization about our present moment. The historic trigger for these events was always a combination of two factors: a debt level that cannot be serviced through taxes and a loss of public faith in the currency. When those two things happen, the state must find a way to perform a wealth transfer. In the past, this was done through the physical removal of a wealthy or visible minority. Today, it is being done through the digital removal of purchasing power. The callback to the Venetian senator Paolo Sarpi is more relevant now than ever. He warned that once a state breaks its contract with one group, it will eventually break it with everyone. We see this today in the way the global financial system is being restructured. The tools that were once used to target specific groups, financial deplatforming, asset freezes, and the weaponization of the banking system, are now being normalized for the general population. The machinery of expulsion has been digitized. You no longer have to be physically moved across a border to be removed from the economy. You just have to have your access to the ledger revoked. The number we discussed at the beginning, the 15,000 people forced out of England in 1290, is small compared to the billions today who are tethered to a global debt bubble. But the logic remains the same. The state is a creature of survival. It does not have friends. It only has interests. And its primary interest is the maintenance of its own credit. The final record of the Spanish expulsion in 1492 describes the silence of the abandoned Jewish quarters in Seville and Toledo. The chroniclers noted that the houses were empty, but the debts were gone. They thought they had achieved a miracle of finance. They did not realize they had just started the countdown to their own decline. The cycle of the 109 expulsions is a warning that the state is never more dangerous than when its bank account is empty. The red ink of the past is the blueprint for the resets of the future. The pattern is not hidden. It is simply written in a language most people are afraid to read, the language of the ledger. The final evolution of the pattern occurs when the state no longer needs to wait for a crisis to act. It begins to engineer the crisis as a form of maintenance. In the late 20th century, we saw a transition from the physical expulsion of bodies to the systemic expulsion of wealth through the international banking system. When the Bretton Woods system was dismantled in 1971, the world entered an era of pure fiat currency. For the first time in history, the state had the power to expand the ledger without any physical limit. This changed the timeline of the cycle, but it did not break it. It simply allowed the debt to grow to levels that would have been unimaginable to King Edward or Queen Isabella. If you look at the sovereign debt crises of the 1980s and 90s, you see the same skeletal structure. When countries like Argentina or the nations of the former Soviet bloc saw their currencies collapse, the state did exactly what the medieval kings did. They suspended the rights of the individual to protect the integrity of the collective debt. They froze bank accounts. They seized pension funds. They pointed to speculators and outsiders as the cause of the misery. The records of the International Monetary Fund show that in every major debt restructuring of the last 50 years, the primary goal was to protect the creditors at the top of the pyramid, while the common citizens at the bottom were forced to eat the losses. This is the expulsion of the many to save the few. There is a final callback we must address. Remember the 15,000 English Jews in 1290 who were given only a few weeks to leave their homes and were stripped of their contracts. Their property was used to fund the king's wars. Today, we are seeing the rise of central bank digital currencies. These are not just new forms of money. They are the ultimate realization of the royal ledger. In a world of digital currency, the state has the power to expire your money, to restrict what you can buy, and to effectively expel you from the economy with a single line of code. The physical ships and the paper edicts of 1492 have been replaced by the database and the algorithm. The pattern they do not discuss is that the state is a perpetual motion machine fueled by the transfer of wealth from the unorganized many to the organized few. The 109 expulsions were the early crude versions of this machine. They were loud, violent, and messy. The modern version is silent, digital, and legal, but the outcome is the same: the reset of the debt, the destruction of the middle class, the survival of the regime. When you look at the history of the world, do not look for the kings and the battles. Look for the interest rates. Look for the debt ceilings. Look for the moments when the math stops working. That is where the real history is written. The people who were expelled were not just victims of hate. They were the casualties of a financial system that had reached its limit. They were the ones who stood between the state and its own bankruptcy. The original ledger of the 1492 expulsion still has blank pages at the end. In the world of the state, the story is never finished. It is just waiting for the next generation to forget the lessons of the last. The cycle of the 109 is not a record of the past. It is a forecast of the future. The state never changes its nature. It only changes its tools. And the ledger always demands to be balanced. The persistence of this cycle suggests that the state is not a stable institution, but a predatory one that undergoes periodic shedding. We must now look at the final piece of the puzzle, the architecture of the comeback. In almost every instance where a civilization expelled its financial class, it eventually realized it could not function without the very expertise it had purged. This led to a secondary, quieter pattern called the invitation. In the late 17th century, only a few decades after the brutal expulsions in Eastern Europe and the Cromwellian reversal in England, a new competition began. The states of Prussia and the fledgling American colonies realized that the empires that had expelled their most productive minorities had inadvertently handed their rivals a massive economic advantage. Frederick the Great of Prussia, a man known for his ruthless military precision, wrote to his ministers that he would build mosques and synagogues in Berlin if it meant bringing in the merchants in the capital needed to compete with the French. He understood that the state's hunger for power would always eventually override its ideological or religious purity. This reveals the true nature of the pattern. The minority is used as a mobile battery. They are charged up during times of growth, drained during times of crisis, and then the battery is thrown away once it is empty. But the state eventually finds itself in the dark and must go looking for a new power source. The records of the 19th century European courts are filled with decrees of emancipation that were not born of a sudden enlightenment, but of a desperate need to industrialize. The state needed the banking networks to fund the railroads. It needed the international connections to secure raw materials. The very people who had been legally barred from society for centuries were suddenly invited into the halls of power, not as equals, but as the only ones capable of saving the state from its own inefficiency. But this brings us back to the sovereign trap. Each time the battery is replaced, the state grows larger. Its appetite for debt increases. Its military becomes more expensive, and the next crash becomes more violent. We are now in the final stages of the largest debt cycle in human history. The global financial system is currently carrying over $300 trillion in debt. There is no minority on Earth large enough or wealthy enough to be seized to pay off that bill. When the state can no longer solve its insolvency by targeting a specific group, it has only one option left. It must target the savings and the labor of the entire population simultaneously. The declassified reports from the 1970s and 80s regarding the transition to a cashless society hint at this final move. The architects of the current system realize that physical cash is a form of freedom that makes the ledger difficult to control. By moving the world toward a purely digital existence, they have created a universal cage. The expulsions of the past were limited by geography. You could flee to a different kingdom. You could move your gold across a border. But in a globalized, digital economy, there is no outside. The ledger is everywhere. Remember the 109 expulsions? Each one was a localized failure of the state to manage its own greed. Today, we are looking at the possibility of a globalized version of that same failure. The pattern they don't discuss is that the target of the next reset is the viewer. It is anyone who holds a balance in a system that is fundamentally insolvent. The state is not looking for a religious minority anymore. It is looking for liquidity. The archives of the 1492 decree and the 1290 edict are not just dusty relics. They are the legal precedents for the emergency powers of the modern era. They show that in the eyes of the government, there is no such thing as private property when the survival of the regime is at stake. The ships that carried the refugees from London and Seville were the ancestors of the banking apps on your phone. They are both vessels for the movement of people and wealth at the whim of a central authority. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The final entry in the English royal accounts for the year 1290 does not mention the suffering of the 15,000. It simply records the total weight of the confiscated silver. In the end, the state only cares about the weight. The cycle of the 109 will continue as long as the state is allowed to spend more than it produces. The ledger will always be balanced. The only question is whose lives will be used to do it. The final stage of the cycle is the most dangerous because it is the stage of the invisible exit. To understand how an empire handles the absolute end of its credit, we have to look at the transition from the 14th century to the 15th century in the city-states of Italy. Venice, Genoa, and Florence were the financial capitals of the world. They were the ones who had perfected the art of the sovereign loan. But they also pioneered the art of the sovereign default. When the kings of France and England could no longer pay back the Italian banks, the banks did not just collapse. They consolidated. They realized that the state is an entity that never truly dies. It only changes its name. The pattern of the 109 expulsions reveals that the state uses a minority to experiment with new forms of financial control. In the Middle Ages, the forced registration of Jewish assets was a precursor to the modern tax return. The seizure of Jewish property in 1306 was a pilot program for the nationalization of industries, and the internal passports required for the Pale of Settlement in Russia were the ancestors of the modern visa and identity card system. The state first applies these pressures to a small, vulnerable group to see how much wealth can be extracted before the system breaks. Once the technology of extraction is perfected, it is scaled up to include everyone. If you look at the way global finance is moving today, you see this scaling in real time. The movement toward a social credit system is not a new idea. It is the digital version of the ghettos of 16th century Venice. In the ghetto, your economic and social life was strictly regulated by the state. You were allowed to participate in the economy only under specific conditions, and your presence was a privilege that could be revoked at any time. Today, the infrastructure for this revocation is being built into the very core of the internet. There is a final callback to the Spanish decree of 1492. Most people remember the expulsion, but few remember the conversos. These were the people who stayed behind by changing their identity, only to find that the state would spend the next 2 centuries hunting them down through the Inquisition to prove that their conversion was a lie. The state did not want their faith, it wanted their inheritance. This teaches us that once the state identifies a source of wealth, a change in behavior or identity is rarely enough to stop the hunt. The state is a hungry machine, and it will keep grinding until the gears are empty. We are now approaching the 300% debt to gross domestic product limit globally. In the past, this was the point where the ships were readied and the edicts were signed. But in a world with no more frontiers, the expulsion cannot be outward. It must be inward. It is the expulsion of the citizen from their own equity. It is the seizure of the future through the permanent debt of the present. The records of the 1290 expulsion in London are held in a room with climate control and high security. They are treated as precious historical artifacts. But they are more than that. They are the source code for the survival of the state. They show that when the choice is between the collapse of the regime and the destruction of a people, the regime will choose itself every single time. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The last word on the topic was likely written by an anonymous merchant in the 17th century who noted that a king who eats his own merchants today will have no bread tomorrow. He was right, but his warning was ignored because kings do not plan for tomorrow. They plan for the next hour. The pattern of the 109 is the heartbeat of a system that lives on the edge of its own destruction. It is the sound of the ledger being forced into balance. And as the debt grows, the sound is getting louder. The final layer of this pattern is not found in the violence of the street, but in the silence of the law. To understand the ultimate destination of the 109 expulsions, we must look at the legal doctrine of bona vacantia. This is a Latin term meaning vacant goods. It is a concept that has existed since the Roman Empire, and it dictates that any property that has no clear owner automatically reverts to the state. In every major expulsion, the state did not just kick people out. It used the law to declare their property vacant. In 1290, the English crown used the fiction that because the Jewish community was leaving the realm, their houses and lands no longer had legal owners. The state did not steal the property. It simply inherited it by default. This legal trick is the foundation of the modern administrative state. It is how governments today handle unclaimed bank accounts, abandoned estates, and even the digital data you leave behind. The state has positioned itself as the universal heir. When we look at the history of the 109, we are looking at the history of the state expanding its definition of what counts as vacant. In the Middle Ages, it was the homes of a minority. In the 20th century, it was the gold in the private vaults of citizens. In the 21st century, it is the very value of the currency in your pocket. Through inflation, the state declares a percentage of your wealth vacant every single year and then reclaims that value for itself. There is a final, haunting callback to the beginning of our investigation. Remember the ships in the harbor in 1492? They were not just carrying people. They were carrying the collective memory of a community that had seen this cycle repeat for over 1,000 years. According to the contemporary accounts of the chronicler Andrés Bernaldez, the departing families hired musicians to play as they walked toward the ports. They were not celebrating. They were trying to keep their spirits from breaking under the weight of the realization that they were being liquidated to pay for a future they would never see. That music was the soundtrack to a sovereign default. We are now living in a world where the debt has reached its final frontier. There are no more new lands to discover and no more new populations to tax into existence. The state is now looking at its own core supporters, its own middle class, and its own infrastructure as the next source of vacant goods. The technology of the expulsion has been perfected. It is no longer a localized event that happens every century. It is a continuous digital process that happens every second of every day. Every time a central bank clicks a button to create more debt, a small piece of your life is being expelled from the ledger. The secret pattern they don't discuss is that the state is not a permanent structure. It is a flame that must constantly be fed. For 2,000 years, it fed on the Jewish community whenever the wood ran low. But the fire is now so large that it is beginning to consume the fireplace itself. The 109 expulsions were the early warnings of a system that is fundamentally parasitic. They were the tremors before the earthquake. Tell us in the comments which name you think historians got wrong. The next time you see a headline about a sovereign debt crisis or a new digital currency mandate, do not think of it as a modern development. Think of the ships in the harbor of London in 1290. Think of the royal auditors weighing the silver spoons. Think of the ledger. The names change, the dates change, and the technology changes, but the hunger of the state is the only constant in human history. The cycle of the 109 is not a chapter in a history book. It is the pulse of the machine we are currently living inside. And the machine is hungry again.